appreciate it that you guys are able to be here on this very cold day. I hear everyone that we're speaking with, it's either 1 degree centigrade, or in the case of Florida, which is where we're at, it's practically almost freezing. It's, I think, 40 degrees outside. Jeremiah can correct me what the temperature is. Very cold over here in Florida. We hope you all are staying warm on this very cold Sunday. And before I begin, Wade, one of our audience who joined really early, had mentioned how cold it was, and he's looking forward to the spiritual warmth of this meeting. So I found it something nice to share. That being said, for everyone who's joining us, welcome. We are live on Sunday, January 30th, 2022. We're so happy to have all of you. We have Mr. Wade Fransen here with us to talk on our very important subject, the first teaching of Baha'u'llah, independent investigation of truth. Abdu'l Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, wrote the following in the wake of World War I. Also a very cold time. There have issued from his mighty pen various teachings for the prevention of war, and these have been scattered far and wide. The first is the independent investigation of truth, for blind imitation of the past will stunt the mind. But once every soul inquireth into truth, society will be freed from darkness of continually repeating the past. Wade Fransen will explore from the perspectives of the Holy Bible, the Baha'i Writings, and contemporary journalism the challenge facing all of us today in applying this simple principle, and what a difference it could make if we found a way to apply it more consistently. Now, a little short bit about Mr. Wade Fransen. He has appeared on several of our sessions here. He is a very unique individual, which we're happy to have. He has written a book, The People of the Sign, where you'll find his unique background detailed there. He was born in Canada, and he lived in 3 countries before obtaining a degree in theology from the Worldwide Church of God's Ambassador College in California. He then moved to Europe, where he was ordained and served from 1984 until 1994 in southern Germany, Switzerland, and countries behind the Iron Curtain. In 1994, Wade accepted a global administrative role in California, from which he resigned in 1995. Wade then taught 4th and 5th grade before launching a successful business, obtaining an MBA, and transitioning to the corporate world. The struggle to balance a career in the for-profit sector while moving beyond rigid dogma towards the practice of true religion led to his work to establish a humanitarian foundation in India. These events are documented in his 2nd book called The Hardness of the Heart. While searching for more complete answers, Wade stumbled upon the Baha'i faith, declaring in 2007, after 2 years of intensive investigation, after a 2010 pilgrimage to the Baha'i World Center, Wade established a publishing company and returned to Chennai, India in 2014 as the keynote speaker at a series of conferences inaugurated by the governor of Tamil Nadu. There, he was presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award, and insights gained are included in his final volume of his trilogy called The Rod of Iron. That is his 3rd book. All 3 books became #1 hot new releases on Amazon in various categories, including Baha'i books. These successes have led to the creation of the Exploring the Bible program on Tuesdays, which targets a Christian audience with a Baha'i-inspired perspective on the Word of God and on the world of God. Wade now lives in Wisconsin with his wife and 2 children, and despite Wade's best efforts, a growing assortment of animals. That being said, for all of you interested, Wade is doing a every other Tuesday, or you could call it 1st and 3rd Tuesday of the month series on the Bible, and he has started that just recently, and you are all welcome to join as they are streamed. They're streamed live on his on his YouTube page for Something or Other Publishing. Something or Other Publishing. That is the YouTube page, or on Facebook for the Baha'i Center of Clearwater. You're more than welcome to join. With that being said, Wade, please, we are ready. Oh no, I can't hear you. Your mouth is moving.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay.
Thank you so much, John. And for all of you, we were struggling with some technology issues here. I have a sort of a technology advisor who advised me to buy all this new equipment for that live stream YouTube program on the first and third Tuesday. And as with any new technology, some of you have experienced this in the Zoom world. Any new technology, no matter how brilliant it seems to be created, will make you temporarily incompetent. And as we were struggling to get that working here before this program, thankfully we got at least an older version of that technology working. I don't have all the new stuff working just yet, but it occurred to me that this is actually a really good introduction for this topic on the independent investigation of truth. Because as you will see as we go through this presentation, humanity as a whole has been challenged with this task as part of its maturation process. We have been challenged to grow up. We have been challenged to become mature. We have been given, as it were, the car keys for the American teenager, the rite of passage, and the freedom and the empowerment that comes with that, with those car keys, when you first get your driver's license and you learn to drive. Depending on who you are, and if you're anything like I was, you have suddenly become a menace to society. It's a joke that, you know, when that teenager gets the car keys, you know, please warn me before you leave the garage so I can stay off the roads. Because when you're first learning to drive and in that first flush of freedom and power, you can actually be quite dangerous to yourself and others. And so it has been, as we will see through this presentation, with this idea of the independent investigation of truth. Some of you are now thinking to yourselves, what the heck is this guy talking about? Well, just stay with me and we will get there. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and jump into some slides here. I'm going to try to keep it quick, as I always try to and rarely succeed, so that we have plenty of time for Q&A. But what I will say this time, this is actually now a two-part program because I've been asked to speak again next week, and that has allowed me to keep it a little bit shorter today. And today we'll talk about the foundational concepts, and then next time we'll get into some really practical examples where the rubber meets the road, keeping that car analogy going here, and where we have to struggle with those things that we are challenged to form an opinion on in today's world, and to form a point of view and a perspective through our own eyes. All right, let's jump into it. I'm assuming everybody can see my screen. Yeah, I'm actually getting that message that you can. So
yes.
Thank you. So this is actually the first teaching of Baha'u'llah. And, you know, I reference Baha'u'llah right here. Let me spend a moment on, you know, a Baha'i fireside. What is a Baha'i fireside? This presentation is a Baha'i fireside, which is a presentation from a Baha'i perspective. But there is no clergy in the Baha'i faith. So even though I was at one point in my life a clergyman, you might say, that has zero relevance here, other than whatever I may have learned and studied that may make my opinion and perspective useful and helpful, turn it into a valid contribution, but I have no authority. What I say here today is in no way authoritative. This is my personal perspective informed by the Baha'i faith. Baha'i firesides are intended to share perspectives that have been arrived at through an independent investigation of reality, both spiritual and physical. Again, this is sort of my definition of it, based on the traditional view of a Baha'i fireside, updating it a little bit, perhaps for our circumstances. The intent of a Baha'i fireside, is to introduce those unfamiliar with the Baha'i faith to some of the understanding Baha'is have arrived at. Given the nature of the investigation of truth, and the independent nature of study within the Baha'i community, it is always my goal to introduce perspectives that will be interesting and perhaps challenging to Baha'is as well as those unfamiliar with the Baha'i faith. So we have a mix of Baha'is and non-Baha'is, of a mix of people familiar with Baha'i faith, involved in the Baha'i faith, or not familiar with, not involved in the Baha'i faith on this presentation. And the challenge to a presenter is to produce a presentation that is interesting and engaging for all participants in this diverse, potentially diverse audience. So I always try to build in some things that may be new, interesting, even provocative for both Baha'is and those who may have little understanding or familiarity with the Baha'i faith who may be in the audience. With that, let's jump in. In the wake of World War I is when that quote from Abdu'l Baha that was referenced was issued, with 15 to 20 million dead. And here it says, well, including in that number 6 to 13 million civilians and an additional 23 million wounded. Abdu'l Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, wrote the following: O ye lovers of truth, ye servants of humankind, out of the flowering of your thoughts and hopes, fragrant emanations have come my way. Wherefore, an inner sense of obligation compels me to pen these words. Ye observe how the world is divided against itself, how many a land is red with blood, and its very dust is caked with human gore. I actually searched, there are many famous quotes about World War I, the war to end all wars, and the incredible shock of the human tragedy, which through newspapers and improvements in communication were being perhaps more readily understood by populations at home across the various countries. But this quote itself did so much justice to it. I just went with this one quote from Abdu'l Baha. The fires of conflict have blazed so high that never in early times, not in the Middle Ages, nor in recent centuries, hath there ever been such a hideous war, a war that is even as millstones taking for grain the skulls of men. Here he's describing a vast machinery that had been created, where elsewhere in the Baha'i writings, it's called the infernal engines of war, I believe, the machinery of war, constructed for the purpose of, as it were, taking the skulls of men as grain in the millstones. Nay, even worse, for flourishing countries have been reduced to rubble, cities have been leveled with the ground, and many a once prosperous village hath been turned into ruin. Fathers have lost their sons and sons their fathers. Mothers have wept away their hearts over dead children. Children have been orphaned, women left to wander, vagrants without a home. From every aspect, humankind hath sunken low. Loud are the piercing cries of fatherless children, loud the mothers' anguished voices reaching to the skies. And this world war did have a tremendous impact on human society, and efforts were made in the wake of World War I, some of you know the history, to make sure that it would not happen again. This is the context, and I found this interesting even as a Baha'i studying into this topic. This is the context of the quote that we're about to read. The breeding ground of war is then addressed as this quote goes on. And the breeding ground of all these tragedies is prejudice. Prejudice of race and nation, of religion, of political opinion. And the root cause of prejudice is blind imitation of the past. Imitation in religion, in racial attitudes, in national bias, and in politics. So long as this aping of the past persists, just so long will the foundations of the social order be blown to the four winds. Just so long will humanity be continually exposed to the direst peril. Now, in such an illumined age as ours, and this is coming actually on the sort of the tail end of the Enlightenment, when realities previously unknown to man have been laid bare, and the secrets of created things have been disclosed, and the morn of truth hath broken up and lit the world, is it admissible that men should be waging a frightful war that is bringing humanity down to ruin? No, by the Lord God. Christ Jesus summoned all mankind to amity and peace. Unto Peter he said, put up thy sword into the sheath. Such was the bidding and counsel of the Lord Christ. And yet today the Christians, one and all, have drawn their swords from out the scabbard. How wide is the discrepancy between such acts and the clear gospel text? And he's referring there to John 18, verses 10 to 11, where Christ was being apprehended, and Peter, in fulfillment of prophecy, took out his sword, and it says here, smote the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. And I remember from past sermons describing how you would, how would it be that you would cut off somebody's right ear? Well, guess what? He wasn't aiming for the ear. He was seeking, to kill this servant. But Jesus said, put your sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? So the context here is Jesus, who's being apprehended, saying, this isn't worth fighting over. And this is the will and purpose of God. I won't belabor that or go into it too much. Abdu'l Baha then gives the solution to these challenging circumstances. 60 years ago, Baha'u'llah rose up, even as the day star over Persia. He declared that the skies of the world were dark, that this darkness boded evil, and that terrible wars would come. From the prison at Akka, he addressed the German emperor in the clearest of terms, telling him that a great war was on the way and that his city of Berlin would break forth in lamentation and wailing. Likewise did he write to the Turkish sovereign, although he was that sultan's victim and a captive in his prison. That is, he was being held prisoner in the fortress at Akka, and clearly stated that Constantinople would be overtaken by a sudden and radical change, so great that the women and children of that city would mourn and cry aloud. In brief, he addressed such words to all the monarchs and the presidents, and everything came to pass exactly as he had foretold. Interesting here in terms of the history, and for those who look for validation about who Baha'u'llah was. One area of independent investigation of truth is perhaps to research the timing of these statements, the pronouncements, and their fulfillment. That's not necessarily the topic for today, however. There have issued from his mighty pen various teachings for the prevention of war, and these have been scattered far and wide. And then Abdu'l Baha launches into this series of teachings, and we're only going to look at this very first one today, but we're going to expand it. We're going to look into it a little bit deeper than I personally have ever done as a Baha'i, or that I have seen or heard others do as Baha'is, because this teaching has the potential of changing the world. And it's a mandate as we enter into an age of maturity that this teaching be practiced. And it is the first teaching. And I'm reminded of a scripture, this isn't in my notes, but where Paul the apostle is talking to one of the churches, and he's telling them, you have need to go back again and revisit the first principles. You have to go back again and revisit the first principles because you have wandered and strayed. It is certainly worthwhile to reflect and revisit this first principle. The first principle that could change the world is the independent investigation of truth. For blind imitation of the past will stunt the mind. But once every soul inquireth into truth, society will be freed from the darkness of continually repeating the past. And again, for those in this audience who are Baha'is and those who are just being introduced to the Baha'i faith, we should not think that we are in any way immune, inoculated, vaccinated, if you will. Today, we're learning that people who have been vaccinated are coming down with COVID and its new variations. this is also an interesting circumstance to ponder in a variety of ways, that those things, those, if you will, spiritual diseases, attitudes, approaches that have led to such turmoil in the past, they take new variations and new forms. And the independent investigation of truth must be an ongoing effort, because the revelation of yesteryear is the blind imitation of today. And this process doesn't stop. Baha'is believe in progressive revelation and the continuing revelation. Now, we also believe that there are stages, and we're in a stage that will last, for centuries before we have a major new move forward. But our understanding of even the last major stage has to be constantly evaluated. This has been proven by every religion of the past. And otherwise, we keep repeating those past errors. So what does this look like? What does the practice of independent investigation of the truth look like? Once every soul inquireth into truth, society will be freed from the darkness of continually repeating the past. Did that happen after World War I? Obviously, it did not happen after World War I. Everyone wanted to have it be the war that would end all wars, but was World War II avoided? Of course not. 40 million to 72 million were then killed in World War II. I'd like to throw in a caveat here because of certain attitudes that might otherwise prevail. Don't think that this is a Western or a European or a United States or a white race issue. This is universally applicable to all humankind. If we were to think only in terms of the Western powers and World War I and World War II as that somehow being unique to us, that would be a violation of the principle we're discussing today. And frankly, part of the problem, as we'll see. Of the 10 deadliest wars in human history, 7 of them were in Asia, with 116 million to 262 million dead. This is a human problem. Its current manifestation, the use of technology to create those infernal engines of war, is simply the latest variation of a condition that is extant across all peoples, all races, all countries, all religions over time. Various ways have been sought to overcome this problem, to address this challenge. In some cases, the cure has only made the problem worse, as we'll see. What about since World War I? There have been over 260 major wars. What about today? This is a geographical map of current wars going on in 2020 and 2021. 36 countries, most of them in the Middle East, Northwest Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as a major ongoing drug war in Mexico. Wikipedia, not necessarily the most pristine source, but on some topics and some issues to represent facts, I find it a quick and easy source. I get that some people will now throw out my entire presentation because of their understanding of Wikipedia as an inaccurate source. And you're free to apply that bias if you want. But I would then just simply ask, find some statistics somewhere else, and you'll find that they probably match these. You can also, even using Wikipedia, dig into the original sources. Again, I'm not proclaiming the virtues of Wikipedia other than it's a quick and speedy resource. And from there, you can dig into primary sources for anything that you have a concern about. The reason I spend a moment on that is because we'll get into journalism and journalistic sources in more deeply next week in the context of investigating the independent investigation of truth. Okay, so they list 40 ongoing wars and conflicts with over 100 combat deaths in 2020 or 21. There's, there's a source then of the map and some of the research I did there at the bottom as well. I'll leave it on for a second for those who wish to go and look at the primary sources, which is always advisable for those who want to dig deeper in the independent investigation of any information or facts. So why is it so hard? Why when Abdu'l Baha has emphasized this simple principle, why this ongoing global problem? Why have we so utterly failed to achieve this simple statement of once every soul inquires into truth, society will be freed from the darkness of continually repeating the past? I promise to look at the perspectives from the Holy Bible, the Baha'i Writings, and contemporary journalism on this challenge facing all of us in applying this simple principle and what a difference it could make. So what qualifies me really to speak on this? I'd like to just share a couple of points. And the reason is not to in any way celebrate myself, but to rather provide a perspective, to try to share the perspective that I bring to this. And again, you can accept or reject my perspective, but I want you to understand it. I want you to be able to consider it honestly. So the book, The People of the Sign, details my particular background as a child. And as we all know, our childhood experiences shape us. One reviewer called my first book a relentless search for truth. It covers events from a very early age that left me confused, disillusioned, untethered, lost, and adrift. An outsider with no people to identify with. The bio that was selected for today mentioned I was in 3 countries before getting my theology degree. And the reason I was in those 3 countries was family dysfunction, including divorce and actually a domestic kidnapping, as some of you know. And I was taken from my mother, who had custody, and smuggled out of the country and lived with aunts and uncles in a different country. That led to this disassociation, this feeling of being untethered and not knowing who to identify with. There I was plopped into a foreign language situation in a different school, and I had to learn a language and adapt to that people and that culture. And their ways were very different in many ways, and their outlook on life and the things that made them proud and motivated them were different from those of Canada or even America. I often joke about the national identity of a Canadian being, well, they're not American, right? Many Canadians have an identity in which they want to make sure everyone knows, look, I'm not American. As you see backpackers in Europe, as I did for years, they always have a Canadian flag, very prominent, and Australians the same way, so that nobody will mistake them for being an American, especially during those years when I was there, because there was a lot of anti-American sentiment in Europe at that time. And so you have these identities and these identity issues that are part and parcel of the challenges that face mankind. And I did not have anyone to identify with. I was isolated and alone, despite, you might say, having racial characteristics that put me in the majority, and yet still I was isolated and an outsider and felt not accepted. I did find a new tribe, a new home, and I dedicated my life to them. And that was the religious group that I became involved in. And the image on this book here of the one hand leading the other hand is actually, I didn't even know at all about this quote when that image was designed, but it does evoke this perspective of blind imitation of the past and how the parents seek to guide the children towards the light, which is actually a good thing. We have children, we have a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old, and we spend a lot of time agonizing over how we instill values and principles and core religious beliefs and empathy and sympathy and virtues and values in our children, or how we bring out those natural virtues that are inherent within each and every human being at birth, by nature of how we were created. But it is a struggle and a challenge to do this in a balanced way. So these circumstances are what helped me form an innate, intense desire and need to arrive at my own conclusions in the midst of all this confusion. Because I thought in that religious group that we were all truth seekers. We were all grounded in the Word of God, the Bible. We spent every day studying the Bible and praying and seeking to come to an understanding of what the truth is. And this of course, went on for decades across my whole life. But what I found out was that this was not really true. To summarize it, or more importantly, as I put here, that this concept of independently investigation of the truth, if you parse it out, if you analyze the words, it is emphatically not a collective trait. If we believe that this is a collective trait, we are not understanding the quote. The independent investigation of the truth is by definition not a collective trait. When you have a collective, that collective actively works against it together. So when you have unity, it actually can be counter to the independent investigation of the truth. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the term groupthink. There were two great novels written. Actually, I just recently researched them because I was telling my daughter about them, my 13-year-old daughter, and I said, you need to read not only 1984, but you need to read Brave New World. Brave New World was written in the 30s, and 1984 was written in the late 40s. And I forget which of them has the term groupthink in it, which of them coins the term groupthink. But groupthink is the enemy of the independent investigation of the truth. Collective ideologies abound. My books open, all three of them, with each one with a different verse or verses and the chorus. Each one has the chorus of this quote from Leonard Cohen, the musician, and his song Anthem. Ah, the wars, they will be fought again. This one is, I think, from the second book. This is like the third and fourth verse. Ah, the wars, they will be fought again. The holy dove, she will be caught again. Bought and sold and bought again. The dove is never free. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. In my view, this verse from Leonard Cohen gets to this point about the independent investigation of the truth succumbing to the collective once the collective believes that it has arrived at the truth. These lines describe a hermetically sealed belief system. In my prior religious practice, the explanations that we had generally satisfied us, and challenges to our belief were either a test from God or a satanic deception. God might be testing us to see if we would remain true to the beliefs that we had, or Satan might be trying to deceive us to abandon the beliefs that we had. But we believed that we had arrived at the truth, and now we had to hold fast to the truth. The Bible even speaks to this: hold fast to the faith once delivered. So you see how the collective can, by definition, counteract the independent investigation of the truth. Beliefs and dogma have this flaw, but throwing off religion, declaring religion to be the problem, leads to even worse outcomes through ideologies and isms. The word ideology first made its appearance in French as idéologie at the time of the French Revolution. The science of ideas, this article further says, was a science with a mission. It aimed at serving people, even saving them, by ridding their minds of prejudice and preparing them for the sovereignty of reason. This was part and parcel of the Enlightenment. Abdu'l Baha referenced even the discoveries that were being made. And one of the things that was going on at the top levels of human society, of human thought, the philosophers, the thinkers, and those people who were informing the leaders, and perhaps more importantly, the revolutionaries, were coming from these philosophers. And ideology was a term at the time that was a wonderful new term about how mankind was entering into this era of reason and the sovereignty of reason in which their minds were being rid of prejudice. The French Revolution was in 1789 to 99. And then in 1843, Karl Marx, in an obscure work on the philosophy of Hegel, wrote, Hegel being a philosopher, religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Elsewhere, it's translated as the opiate of the masses. This contextualizes Karl Marx's quote. It softens it a bit. It gives it its context and why it made sense. Today, the shortened version of religion being the opiate of the people sounds entirely and completely negative. But that's actually not what he was getting at if you read the context, which is one reason why this was so readily adopted. But the net result was the same. The soundbite caused people to throw religion out, to declare religion to be the problem and have no part in the solution, which led to ideologically driven mass murder. I mentioned this in the intro about when I was an adolescent having a driver's license, and in the context of my newfound freedom and my adolescent arrogance, I was dangerous. I would compare this transition to the adolescence of our species, which we've been going through. Millions died in 1917 to 18 as a result of the Russian Revolution in 1917, which was informed and influenced, of course, by Marx and that quote, religion being the opiate of the people. Under Stalin, it is estimated that an additional 20 to 60 million people were brutally murdered in what is elsewhere classified as a genocide. And yet Time magazine put Stalin on its cover 11 times. Russian public opinion polls still rank Stalin near the top of the greatest leaders of Russian history, as if he were just another one of the powerful but bloodthirsty czars. There is a reason for Russian obliviousness. Every family had not only victims, but also perpetrators. A vast network of state organizations had to be mobilized to seize and kill that many people. Neymark, in this book, Genocide, which is going to be cited here in a minute, wrote this, estimating that tens of thousands were accomplices. So because they were complicit, they never really processed it. The Germans were a bit better. There's this term Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and I lived in Germany for 10 years from 84 to 94. While there, I met many who were adults during World War II, but none of them could bring themselves to admit that they, quote, knew what was going on with the Jews during World War II. Even though the Germans have very carefully and decisively tried to come to grips with the past and be open and honest with the past and process it and admit what they did and be on, in some cases, the forefront of the research into the horrors of Nazi Germany in the effort of a serious attempt at coming out of it, at learning from the past. And yet this complicitness, this inability to admit that you were wrong, this inability to confess that you were part of the problem, that you and your own ideology and beliefs, that you ascribed to it, and that therefore you were part of the problem. This difficulty, this challenge in the human psyche is just one of the many reasons why this blind imitation of the past, why we can't really admit and accept the past. And of course, that's going on in the United States in the issue of our past, in the issue of racism and slavery and how we process that. That's our own, if you will, Vergangenheitsbewältigung in the United States, as well as other national sins that we have. So moving on more towards the solution versus the problem, the Baha'i faith does offer a clear way out. However, I wanted to spend the time I did leading up to this so that no Baha'i comes to the conclusion readily or quickly that we have all the answers. The answers are accessible to us and to everyone. The Baha'i faith teaches that all the religions are one, and therefore these answers are accessible to anybody around the world because they've all had religions available to them. They all have holy texts and they all teach essentially the same thing. You can arrive at these same conclusions. The Baha'i faith does introduce fresh, new perspectives, but much of it, as is described in the hidden words, is simply a repackaging of powerful messages that make them readily accessible in this day and age, and further evolve the solutions that have always been made available. We'll see a little bit of this as we move forward. So I don't want to here come across as though the Baha'i faith has all the answers and that everybody just needs to become a Baha'i. That is emphatically not what I am saying here. I'm going to use the Baha'i quotes and some other quotes to show where the solutions lie. But I'm happy to say that the Baha'i faith does offer a clear way out through very clear formulation in modern terms and in updated language for the solution of this. The path out of it is justice. Here's from Baha'u'llah, the second hidden word. O son of spirit, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom if you desire me, and neglect it not, that I may confide in thee, that I may give you insight, that I may give you answers, that I may give you what I have, that I may share with you the things of God. By its aid, the aid of justice, you shall see with your own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and shall know of your own knowledge and not through the knowledge of your neighbor. That intrinsic internal compass, that conscience that can convict us at the level of our soul and change and modify us and our behavior and help turn us into part of the solution versus part of the problem. We will never get there through seeing this through the eyes of someone else. It has to, as the Bible says, cut asunder bone, marrow, and soul, the two-edged sword of the word of God. By the aid of justice, you shall know of thine own knowledge and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. Ponder this in your heart, how it behooves you to be. There's that piercing, what are you going to do about it kind of statement. Verily, justice is my gift to you and the sign of my loving kindness. Set it then before your eyes. We're going to spend the rest of the presentation time here unpacking this quote in a couple of ways. Religion and science, for example, are to be viewed as being in harmony, but we must work to discover this harmony. The same is true of any area of disagreement. And again, this quote was from the hidden words of Baha'u'llah in Arabic, the second hidden word. So let's talk for a moment about unity and diversity. Achieving unity while maintaining diversity is the challenge of our day, in my opinion. Again, getting back to this concept and this challenge that independent investigation of the truth is an individual activity and the collective works against it if we are not consciously working in a way that allows both unity and diversity. Diversity is not simply diversity of race. I see this frequently in the Baha'i community, an emphasis on diversity and race, but Abdu'l Baha, and this is just an aside, Abdu'l Baha calls racial distinctions the least of all distinctions. The distinction of color is the least of distinctions. The other distinctions, the distinctions of culture, the distinctions of thought, of perspective, of vision, of worldview, of ideology, if you will, these go much deeper than the color of one's skin. The color of one's skin is certainly a huge issue, a problem, right? If we dismiss somebody through prejudice based on the color of their skin, if we practice racism, it short circuits any progress. It's terribly destructive. But in theory, that's an easy problem to overcome. Once one accepts that all the races are equal and accepts that one should have the same love for any person, regardless of race, that's easier, in my view, to overcome than differences of culture, differences of opinion, differences of viewpoint, which lead to behaviors and actions that one can't accept. Once I learned to accept the color of a person, that's a simple thing. But I might fight for the rest of our relationship and struggle with the issues of a difference of perspective and culture. I lived in Switzerland during my ministerial training, and the rich cooperative history of Switzerland informed my thinking. Switzerland has 5 other official names which speak to its diversity, right? It has 4 official languages and a rich history. I would encourage some of you to study a little bit into the history of Switzerland by way of understanding the evolution of the world progressive revelation and the advancement of mankind and the movement towards peace and what Baha'is call the most great peace. The USA and USSR have been competing examples, and their competing views for the world dominated the latter half of the 20th century. I gained insight into all this in late August 1991 on a trip to Leningrad, which was then St. Petersburg. I was coming in from Finland to work with a group of people at Radio TV Leningrad. And for those who may recall, August 1991, what was special about that time? Well, this was the height of the Gorbachev era, and there was a coup in Russia and Gorbachev was abducted. But when I was in Sweden, I didn't know this happened. And I got a call and I was told to stand down and not head to Leningrad because there was a coup and the situation was dangerous. And I ignored that advice and I drove in through Finland. And for those of you who know the geography, it's around, I think it might have been about a 4 or 6 hour drive, something like that. And it's just desolate. This was the internet had, sort of emerged barely, right? It's barely there. There were faxes, there were texts, there were emails, but there were no cell phones. And so we're completely in the dark information-wise. And as we're heading into St. Petersburg, tanks are heading there from Moscow. And it was an explosive, dangerous situation, one that was fraught with all kinds of tension. When we came into the streets of St. Petersburg, it was desolate. There was nothing on the streets because everyone was in lockdown, afraid of another revolution and massive death of civilians. But what we also didn't know is the tank stopped 50 miles outside of Leningrad, and the soldiers laid down their arms and said, "We will no longer open fire on our own people." This is the backdrop, the context of a discussion that we had with these young, Western-oriented, intelligent, English-speaking individuals working at Radio TV Leningrad. And there was a project, I was there to support this project. I was bringing in supplies and moral support because I was a minister at this time. And I was providing physical and moral support to this group of people in there behind, the Iron Curtain that had dropped, and now they were opening up. So the point is, we had intense, deep discussions with these people in Leningrad, and they were telling us how in this time of crisis, the satellite nations of Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia would return to Mother Russia in her time of crisis. And my reaction, which I didn't say, my internal reaction was, what kind of crack are you guys smoking? Though the hatred of those satellite nations is so deep to Mother Russia, they will never come to your aid for any reason and under any circumstances. You oppressed those people for decades, and they're so glad to be free, they will never come back to you. And I asked myself, why? What could possibly have caused these ideas in the minds of these young people who were so intelligent, so educated, Western-oriented, to not be aware of this? And it was at that moment that I realized the depth of this truism, that everyone believes they're right. No matter what you believe, you are just like I was in that hermetically sealed belief system, in a bubble in which your viewpoints and your ideologies, your perspectives are being reinforced. Your interpretation of the facts is being filtered through your own preconceived ideas, biases of every kind. This is why it's so hard. And whatever you grow up in, whatever you ascribe to, wherever your identity is, whatever belief system, whether it's Baha'i, Christian, atheist, whether it's Russian, American, whether it's liberal humanitarianism, the constructs of your ideologies and your belief system are reinforcing your worldview. And that's because the collective works against the independent investigation of the truth. Other differences, divisions, and competing visions dominate the news cycle today. But for Baha'is, and I'm sharing this with those who are interested in the Baha'i faith, we have a very clear mandate, the importance of which cannot be overestimated. This is from the Universal House of Justice of the Baha'i faith. This is a very recent statement addressing the ongoing disintegration of any kind of unity, any kind of construct, any kind of political structure, any kind of stability, any foundation. The disintegration of civilization is ongoing. And this is the mandate to Baha'is in this situation, because we're supposed to be part of the forces of integration. We are not supposed to be contributing to the forces of disintegration. This is how an integrator must form his thinking or her thinking. But whether through deeds or words, the merit of your every contribution to social well-being lies first. And this first principle, right? The first principle of the teaching of the Baha'i faith, this is perhaps an application of that. The merit, the value, the substance of your every contribution to social well-being lies first in your resolute commitment to discover that precious point of unity where contrasting perspectives overlap and around which contending peoples can coalesce. You could literally spend an hour looking up the meaning of every one of these words and letting the meaning of this sentence sink in. What is the word merit? Whether through deeds or words, your every contribution, social well-being, resolute commitment, precious point where contrasting perspectives overlap and around which contending peoples can coalesce. But the most important word to me here in the context of today's presentation is that little word, discover. That little word, discover. What this says to me, what I take away from this sentence is, we have yet to discover this. If we had it already, the word discover wouldn't need to be used. The word discover indicates we haven't got it. We haven't found it. And this is, of course, true because every situation, every circumstance is new and unique. In any single discussion between 2 or 3 people, we have to discover where the unity lies. We cannot go into any discussion with a preconceived idea or a preconceived solution. The world is constantly changing. The challenge is constantly morphing. COVID became Delta, became Omicron. It's constantly metastasizing and morphing and changing. Racism today is very different from racism in the 1920s when Abdu'l Baha wrote about it. The manifestation of racism today is multifaceted. Back then, it was very simple in the United States. Very simple. The Jim Crow laws, the oppression, slavery had been abolished, but there was vast, gross oppression by whites against blacks. Today, it's much more subtle. And that's all I'll say about that. It's much more complex and multifaceted. It is metastasizing in various ways. Religion and science are to be viewed as being in harmony, but we must work to discover this harmony. I've so frequently heard statements such as, well, this sort of oversimplified soundbite. Well, where science proves religion wrong, you have to throw out religion. It's actually not that simple, friends. It's not that simple. Science does not trump religion, because you show me, where does true science exist today? It doesn't exist. Science is a process. It's an exploration. The more complex the problem, the more difficult the science, the more nuanced, the more bias enters in by definition of how you define the problem or present the hypothesis of what it is you're trying to solve, you'll get a different solution. Let's take medical science as an example. The entire medical science industry is built around the profit motive. It is the Western nations that in many ways are advancing science, and their goal is to create products and services which can sustain the organization that is doing the research. And so the bias is not to cure illness. The bias is to turn patients into lifelong customers and to provide products that they will have to consume on a daily basis for the rest of their lives. And if they get well, they won't do that, right? This is a systemic bias. This is an institutionalized, greed-driven profit motive that does not have the best interest of the patient at heart. I'm not seeking to monolithically, one-sidedly. I'm just saying that's one perspective. That perspective has to be taken into account in any consultation. And I'll throw in that idea of consultation here. Baha'is know what I'm talking about. True consultation is the solution to achieving diversity and unity. So for example, in the context of religion, we have this quote: "The faith standing identified with the name of Baha'u'llah disclaims any intention to belittle any of the prophets gone before him, to whittle down any of their teachings." What does it mean to whittle down? Well, that's a lost art. But back up in Alaska, I knew a couple of whittlers. They could take a stick of wood and they could turn it into a little mini sculpture by carefully taking off one little piece after the other, whittling, taking a little slice of wood here, a little slice of wood here, slowly changing that piece of wood into something else. And in the end, there was less wood there, but it was a much more beautiful artifact. The art of whittling is a great one, but here it's in the context of whittling down, making it, diminishing it, little caveats, and well, it doesn't mean this, well, it's corrupt here. Well, no. The Baha'i faith does not have any intention to whittle down any of their teachings, to obscure, however slightly, the radiance of their revelations, to oust them from the hearts of their followers, to abrogate the fundamentals of their doctrines, to discard any of their revealed books, or suppress the legitimate aspirations of their adherents. In other words, Baha'is want, or should want, the participation of diverse inputs. We should not want a monoculture of thought, of religion, of race. We should want a diversity of ideas. This is the antidote to the fact that the collective works against the independent investigation of the truth. When we allow and encourage diversity of thought, perspective, and when we search for that common ground, when we try to discover which part of group A's perspective and which part of group B's perspective contains part of the solution, that's when we can achieve unity in diversity. This is the same is true for any area of disagreement. Take your pick, again, from today's news cycle on what the topic is, what the contention is, what the proposed path is, as these various groups are declaring the other group to be the Antichrist or the end of democracy or a threat to our national institutions. Whatever one group is accusing the other of, they're usually doing it twice as much themselves. Here's some ancient advice. I promised some inputs from the Bible. And I'm referring here to doing the math because those of you who have heard me present elsewhere, I often talk about the sound bites that we adhere to and the fact that Baha'is in particular may have answers from the back of the book, as in when you were in algebra, geometry, or algebra 2, and you could go to the back of the book to get the answer, but the teacher, if they were smart, would devise a way to make you prove that you could do the math. Well, here's where some of the math comes from. Here's one from 2,000 years ago. Paul says to Timothy, I believe it is, "Wherefore I put you in remembrance that you stir up the gift of God which is in thee by the putting on of my hands." There was a practice in Christian religion, we used to practice this. We would baptize, and then we would do the laying on of hands, where you would, as the minister, you would place your hands, and you didn't have to be a minister, by the way, but whoever was performing the baptism would place one's hands on the head of the person being baptized. And this goes back to the priesthood in ancient times. And then pray that the gift of the Holy Spirit would enter into that person. And it didn't come through the person. It was a sign of obedience and submission to the will of God. And the person was submitting himself not only to the will of God, but to the authority of the religious organization. And then God would give that individual his Holy Spirit. And that spirit then is described. God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Again, not something uniquely new, but certainly refreshed and made more clear. But when we struggle with algebra, sometimes it's helpful to go even further back. This is now a quote that has really informed my thinking over the last several decades. And this comes from the book of Deuteronomy. Thou shalt not have in thy bag diverse weights, a great and a small, but thou shalt not have in your house diverse measures, a great and a small, but thou shalt have a perfect and just weight. A perfect and just measure shalt thou have, that thy days may be lengthened in the land which thy Lord God giveth thee. For all that do such things and all that do unrighteously are an abomination unto the Lord. Abomination, I call it the A word. It's like the worst horrible thing God could say, an abomination to God, that which is a stench in his nostrils, right? Something that is abhorrent in the eyes of God. And I read this, and I'm like, why is this an abomination? And by the way, this was long before I became a Baha'i. Why is this an abomination? Why is it an abomination to have two sets of weights? Just a little bit of, why is it unfair that if you're buying, you have one price, and if you're selling, you have another price? Everyone in retail knows you have to have a markup, right? Well, the issue here is that you are deceiving and confusing people, right? It is dishonest. While it might be okay and fair to be a retailer that buys items at one price and sells them at another, when you're a grocery store and you have to do your work, you're adding value, you're going out and sourcing things that you put in your store. Weights, by the way, were the means by which, grain, oil, whatever was measured out, whatever it was that was being bought and sold, the weight would determine the value of it. So why is that an abomination? And I realized it's the deception of it, and it's symbolic of something more. But what is interesting here in the context of this is I highlighted diverse, right? So what's interesting to me in looking at this is we want unity in diversity. The diversity comes from outside, but we, in pursuing justice, this correlates to that quote about justice. Justice being the best beloved of God. In seeing justice with our own eyes, if we're in the habit of having diverse weights and measures, we will never understand justice. That's why it's an abomination. We must throw out the diverse sets of weights and measures in every aspect of our life. What am I getting at here? Double standards. What is a double standard? It's treating two things that are the same as though they were different. It's treating blacks different from whites. It's treating our friend differently than our foe. What did Jesus say? Love your enemies. It's treating people from another country different than those in our own country. If the two things are the same, they must be treated equally. That's why we cannot have a diverse set of weights and measures. But there's an inverse to this as well, and that's called a false equivalency. A false equivalency is treating two things that are different as though they are the same. This might be the equivalent of diverse weights and diverse measures, right? We must treat things that are the same, exactly the same, but we must not treat things that are different in the same way either. Those are called false equivalencies. So the understanding that that color makes no difference is the first one, if you will. They are no different. There's no difference between a black, a white, a person from Asia, a person of any other race, and all those areas that we are told to treat the same. But if things are really different, we must discern that as well. So applying this lens of double standards and false equivalencies is one way to scientifically get at it. It's the equivalent of addition and subtraction in doing more complex algebraic formulas. So in order to take oneself into account every night, one might ask oneself, was there anything today where I treated people differently that I should have treated the same? Or false equivalencies, am I giving myself a get out of jail free card on some issue? Right? So next time, we'll look at practical examples of all this. The specific challenges facing us in the United States of America today. Are we united? What divides us? Are we one nation under God? What are the dominant ideologies and religions of today? And I don't necessarily mean religions, but the ideologies that people accept as their religion today. Are we following people who are wandering in the paths of delusion? Are we utilizing the tools that help clear up the confusion? Those are questions that we'll address next week. Is our bag of weights pure and calibrated accurately? Does our compass point north? We'll dive into all these questions, and I'll provide my perspective on them next time. To continue this discussion, I welcome email. Many of these topics, I sit here and I hold forth and I speak for an hour and present my perspective. But trust me, I'm a firm convert of the idea that your perspective is equally valid, and for you to challenge me in what I say. And when we consult, and as Abdu'l Baha said, consultation leads to the spark of truth only, another one of those little words that has power and meaning, only through the clash of differing opinions. Those are his words. Only through the clash of differing opinions will the shining spark of truth emerge. Again, that is one way in which we overcome the collective tendency to squelch, squash, and stop the independent investigation of truth. And with that, hopefully I've left at least a few minutes for some Q&A. John, back over to you.
Thank you for that presentation. And to remind everyone, we'll be continuing this in the second part in the following week. That'll be in 7 days from now on Sunday. So a question we have is about this concept of diversity of thought. How do you see the diversity of thought continuing amongst people when they consult on things and people inadvertently feel something is right and something is wrong, and the minority feels that what they think is right, which is converse to what others feel is right, conflicts? How do you determine how to deal with differing opinions when some of them are very emotionally charged?
Great, very good question. And there are probably 3 or 4 different components of that question. I'm going to try to be very quick and answer several aspects of it. Again, just from my perspective. First of all, as a Baha'i, I believe that in this age of maturity, there's a structure whereby we submit to the majority opinion and decision. So that's actually sacred. Once consultation has occurred, we submit to the majority opinion, which then may be proven wrong over time through our participation in it. And that only if we submit to it can we collectively come to the understanding that it's wrong. However, I would caution every Baha'i that too glibly and naively accepts this. To think about the fact that throughout human history, the majority is usually always wrong. Go look at any circumstance, any situation. History is history not an example of over and over and over and over and over again the majority being proven wrong over time, and that some of those minority opinions had the magic that would have solved it. So do not just take too much comfort in the fact that you're part of a majority. So in other words, and now leading on to a second part of the answer, the minority opinion must be respected. And again, in the Baha'i faith, I hear this all the time. You know, we're very, very quick to make sure that if there is a minority by race or color or by sex, especially if it's a female minority. I'm on something called the local spiritual assembly here in Madison, and I'm one of only 2 men. And I consistently feel like, even though my opinion is a minority opinion, the majority doesn't want to hear it and doesn't let it be known. Whereas if that situation were reversed, here again, it's a double standard and false equivalency. If the minority opinions were women in the Baha'i community today, we're very, very aware to make sure that that minority voice gets heard, right? So whether it's race, sex, whether it's other reasons why there's a minority opinion, we're pretty good at giving that minority opinion full voice. We're pretty good, we're getting better at making sure that that minority opinion has a stage and to be expressed and considered. And everyone around that table is sort of schooled to know that they should make sure that that minority opinion is heard. However, the whole point of this presentation is to show that in certain areas of perspective, culture, we don't recognize those minority opinions as minority opinions. We recognize them as dissenting voices, and we don't allow them to be voiced. We don't allow them to be heard. So in order for this submission to the majority to work, we must get better at allowing minority voices to be heard. And again, I'm not talking about racial minorities, obviously those too, but those are obvious on the surface, and those are ever before our eyes. We see those differences very clearly. But if an opinion is expressed that's different, we often go into fight mode immediately without recognizing, wait a minute, this is a minority opinion, and we need to let that minority opinion be fully heard. The third point I want to make is that in Baha'i consultation, we should detach ourselves from our opinions. But again, for minority opinions, and I think racial minorities fully understand this, how difficult it is for them to be heard, because they're not allowed, people are already in a prejudiced way judging them based on their color, which is ever present before our eyes. So that still does impact our ability to consult, because we don't view it as an equal perspective, and we color it, pun intended, by virtue of who it's coming from. In consultation that I've experienced very frequently, something is found. It might be the tone, it might be a specific word choice, and people, Baha'is in particular, who engage in consultation are very sophisticated and adept at picking on one little thing. It might also be the source. For example, I get into a lot of discussions about current events, and if I quote Wikipedia or if I quote from a certain news source, the other side, if you will, of this discussion is very quick to just jump on that one little thing that allows them to dismiss it all, or even worse, and this is the worst thing, personalize it, and then start to characterize it as my opinion, as my perspective, and personalize it to me. And I describe this as being like, I put it on the table and I try to detach from it. I say, friends, this is a perspective that needs to be considered. And somebody else picks it up based on tone, source, comment, some of the things I mentioned. And they grab a nail and they hammer it back to my head to make sure that it is now attached to me. that somehow they've reattached this idea to me, and now they can dismiss it because I'm attached to it, right? But I'm not the one attached to it. I'm trying to detach from it and introduce it to the consultation, but somebody else is reattaching it to me and therefore dismissing it, right? So we have all these sophisticated ways in this collective. Remember, independent investigation of the truth is an individual activity, and the collective, sort of works against that introduction of a new or different idea or perspective. So sort of a rambling response, but those are some of the challenges as this questioner is bringing up. It is a challenge to arrive at consensus and maintain diversity of thought while arriving at a unified course of action. But in the Baha'i faith, the participants submit to the majority decision with the knowledge that the majority must reevaluate the outcome of that decision at some point in the future. And the person has a right to say, we've been doing this for a year, and to me, it seems like we're banging our head against the wall. And I'd like to reintroduce that thing I said a year ago, of course, which is very difficult because now it's like, well, you're just saying, I told you so. Well, I kind of am saying I told you so, but I'm bringing it up now. We have new evidence, we have new facts, we have experience. Can we reevaluate this decision? Because it still seems wrong to me. And I've gone along with it. And you can see, friends, I've been supporting it for a year, but I think it's time to reevaluate this decision. So that's sort of nuts and bolts, both theory and nuts and bolts dynamic of how this works. Hopefully I provided a perspective and an answer to that might be helpful.
Thank you for explaining that. I think there's a lot more questions that can come out of it. And my personal point on this is that consultation, as I absorbed from you, consultation is something that is full of learning experiences, and we need to not just learn from each other, but we need to be humble when we come to learn together. We need to be humble, and we need to ask questions that is introspective just as much as we ask the group, as to our form, as to the spirit in which we are consulting. But I think one last part, my personal take on this, one last part to it is when there is this group meeting in consultation, that when people have an idea, it's no longer personal, they detach themselves from it. It's now the group's idea, and it remains in the middle. It remains a part of the group, and it remains a property, if you will, of those who are present consulting together as a collective, and it's no longer personal to me, it's no longer personal to you, it's personal to the group only, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But the group then has to embrace it, and then it's a synthesis, right? In science, you have this concept, and in debate, of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? You have a thesis, you have a hypothesis. Then you have an antithesis and antithesis. You have somebody say, well, on the one hand, this, and on the other, I love that movie Fiddler on the Roof, for those of you who know it. Tevye is always doing this, right? On the one hand, but on the other hand, right? And then you come up with a synthesis of those views. And that's what the common, if that minority perspective is not somehow integrated in, we're not doing justice. Different definition of the word, right? But similar, we're not doing justice to consultation if we aren't striving for synthesis, right? That's why that quote from the Universal House of Justice about discovering the precious point of unity around which contending people can coalesce, right? Can coalesce. This is also true in chemistry and many other physical functions where the bonding of elements creates a new element. I have had all my mercury alloy fillings removed because I don't believe that should ever be in your teeth, right? But the reason they used to put that in your teeth is because chemically, they said the mercury, which is toxic, in a dentist's office, if they spilled a little vial of mercury, they would bring in the hazmat people. Why would you put that in your mouth? But the bonding chemically so neutralizes the ability of that mercury that it was believed it can't escape. Now, I don't want to overstate that. I don't want to encourage anyone to have mercury alloy fillings. I could show you research where you should not have that in your mouth. But the point is, it almost defeats the point I'm making, but it's the first off the top of my head analogy that I came to. But in chemistry, you take two elements and they bond and they become a third different new element. That's kind of what is supposed to happen in consultation.
Yeah, they become a compound that has different physical features. Yes. And that I think that the essence of what you're saying, I think that people, if they try to investigate the essence of what you're saying, that it's the essence of your message is very clear to understand, and that matters, that there's this combination that is a whole new product that wasn't conceived by those who brought their ideas, and it is the intended result. And maybe not the exact thing that is decided upon is the intended result, but the fact that people are ultimately combining their ideas into a better option rather than the two options originally even consulted on, that is really a beautiful product that comes out of it, that no one would have reasonably understood to be in the beginning what the reality will be, but there's an expectation that something new will come out of it. And that being said, I wanted to actually pose Lisa's question. Lisa had a question about where, Wade, you mentioned about the opiate of the masses.
Yep, I saw that question. Let me quickly go back to the quote and discuss it from there. So this is the slide that had that answer, or it had that. So here's the context of the quote, and even in the immediate context, you can see what I'm getting at. Now, I believe the quote is negative, right? I believe the quote was used intentionally to minimize the impact and the effect of religion. I believe that there are over 100 million people were brutally murdered, and it's debatable, right? There was also mass starvation through the policies, right, of communism. But whether it was in Russia, whether it was in communist China, whether it was in Cambodia, which are the three main, some of you may have seen the movie The Killing Fields, the three main instances of communist revolutions. And for those who don't know, in the Baha'i faith, communism is listed, I believe, as one of the three great idols. Why? Partially because of the combination of these ideas, including the toxic compound of introducing religion being the opiate of the masses. That was one of the elements that created this toxic compound. So yes, it is absolutely negative. Please don't misunderstand. What I said was the context of the quote softens the negativity and makes it, it's like the spoonful of sugar that made that medicine go down, right? And right here you see that what he said was, religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. These are very positive statements about religion. Is it not the sigh of oppressed peoples? I mean, go look at God's description of taking the children of Israel out of Egypt, right? And giving them religion, right? Look at the Baha'i faith and Baha'u'llah being imprisoned, right? But again, the intent, so Marx was definitely driving at removing religion from society and from ideologies, right? So hopefully that explains it. I am not saying that the quote is in essence not negative. It is, in my opinion. But you see these sweeteners, these softeners around it, in which Marx contextualizes it by saying religion is the expression of oppressed people. And even opiates have their place. If Baha'is believe that opiates are soul destroying, but Baha'is also believe that if you go and your doctor recommends a painkiller or a sedative for an operation or whatever, that it's okay to take it under the guidance and advice of a doctor. It's that narrow, thin line, right? Of, it might be okay to have a doctor prescribe it for a limited use in a certain circumstance, but if you're not careful, the next thing you know, you're addicted to opiates, to opioids, and it's a mass tragedy in this country. And there again, getting back, sorry to digress, but this whole medical complex, go read the news about how the opioid epidemic started and why the drug was created and how it was pushed by the medical industry to fatten the wallets and to buy the houses and the cars of these people that created it. Why? Because the intent may be noble to alleviate the suffering, but it wasn't actually intended to solve any disease or to make people better. It was designed as a product that could be repeatedly sold day after day after day in large quantities to people. Hopefully that answered your question somewhat. At least sharing the perspective of why I said what I said and what I actually said.
Well, Wade,
but one more comment. You can go look it up, look up the full quote and read the context even more broadly. And then let's talk about it, because maybe I'm wrong.
Well, actually, what we mentioned here about this concept, it's interesting where the Baha'i faith brings this moderation, and there's this clear radicalization that can easily occur, which we see around us. You have obviously the complete rejection of religion, which is the platform of communism. And then on the other side, you have in the other sphere, the fanaticism that has risen around the world as well. And it was very prevalent when these words were spoken, the subject of religion being the opiate of the masses in a negative light. It was very well understood that fanaticism was real, and it was very much a obstacle to progress. So there's a quote.
This is a more recent, expansion of that idea by Sam Harris, The End of Faith. It's considered a go-to work by many of those who continue that project of sidelining religion and declaring religion to be the problem. And here's where we can also agree with these people, because religion, I've shared before, I argued with the Baha'is for a full year that the religions are not all one, that the religions are out there killing and murdering each other, and that these religions are coming from the religions other than my own were deceptions of Satan, right? That Muhammad wasn't really a messenger of God, for example, that the Quran was a satanic attempt to dilute the true religion and to, create a people that were at war with the true religion. I, of course, have moved on and come to a much broader understanding of how all these things fit together, and that God has indeed, as it says in the book of Hebrews of the Bible, in many ways and in diverse times spoken to people through the prophets, and that this doesn't mean exclusively the Hebrew prophets, but that people all over the world at all times and in every era have had messengers that have come to them from God. But every time that happens, that's when, as it says in some of the quotes I even quoted today, that's when the leaders of that religion, or Leonard Cohen in particular, brings this out. The holy dove is bought and sold and bought again. People are turning religion into commerce, right? They're cordoning off a little section of a pool at the edge of the lake, which needs to be part of an ocean, and they're declaring that pool, which is stagnant, filthy water, to be the truth. And this is a problem, and religion does lead to that when it is not properly understood, just like science. When people start talking about the science, that's when I start getting argumentative and saying, show me the science, show me your clinical research, show me the papers. And then you realize they don't have a clue what they're talking about. They're citing some political soundbite and calling it the science. And they have no clue what the science is underneath that, and that science that they're quoting is contested by many leading scientists, and that science hasn't reached a conclusion. at all about the thing that they are so dogmatically stating to be the science. And it's the same is true of any kind of perspective in religion and ideology, because the collective is the enemy of the independent investigation of the truth.
And with that said, it's a quote that I was able to pull here from the Baha'i international community, a very prudent points to help us close for today, to understand the Baha'i position. The Baha'i international community's report in 1987, the Baha'i position on the issue of religious fanaticism, something that is a common question that people have. There has been a revival of religious fanaticism in all parts of the globe and among people of varied faiths. It is a truly worldwide phenomenon, and in our view, a deeply disturbing one, for religious fanaticism breeds hatred and violence. We need not look far to find numerous examples in the world today of the civil strife, terror, and human suffering that religious fanaticism has wreaked upon religious communities and entire nations. Its pernicious influence can be found at the root of all too many of the wars, conflicts, and other ills undermining the peace in the world, including the problem of terrorism. May I remind you all, this is 1987, and Shoei Effendi first coins the term terrorism, and this is way far back compared to when it became a common term among the general public. But they mentioned the problem of terrorism. Fanaticism represents a perversion of religion and is directly contrary to the humane teachings brought by the founders of all the great religions of the world. We believe that the purpose of every religion has been to promote unity among all the peoples of the world and to outlaw war and violence in human affairs. All the major religions have taught the golden rule. The violence and disruption associated with religious fanaticism testifies to its spiritual emptiness. Fanaticism destroys the very foundations of human solidarity by dividing the world into contending factions, each believing itself to be superior to others and to have an exclusive claim on religious truth. These actions and attitudes negate the very purpose of religion. The current outbreak of religious fanaticism, while overturning the spiritual values conducive to the unity of mankind, also works to undermine the unique achievements of each of the religions it pretends to serve. The outstanding contributions made to the welfare of society by the teachings of the great religions are steadily being overshadowed by the atrocities committed in the name of those same religions. Fortunately, the contemporary phenomenon of religious fanaticism does not, in our view, signal the dawn of a new era of religious strife. Indeed, we believe that it represents the dying convulsions of doctrines and societies which have openly defied the altruistic teachings of their own faiths. We believe that all men and women of good will can contribute towards hastening the end of religious fanaticism. They can do this first by living up to the high ideals of love, unity, and tolerance that lie at the center of their own religions or beliefs. Everyone must be taught to respect the beliefs of others so that they will not merely tolerate, but positively respect those who hold different beliefs. Baha'i communities around the world are already implementing educational programs along these lines as their contribution to eliminating fanaticism under any guise and to implementing the principle of unity among peoples of every faith and belief. They will persevere in their efforts until the fire of religious fanaticism and hatred is finally extinguished. And for all of your research purposes, this is a quote from the Baha'i International Community in March of 1987, entitled, "Eliminating Religious Intolerance." So with that being said, I think we're ready for part 2, Wade.
Thank you for the opportunity. I hope to see some of you here next week to get into the nitty-gritty details. It should be interesting.
Thank you, everyone, and have a beautiful Sunday.